I'd like to talk to you a little bit about those early on days when NLP wasn't even around. So if you look at page 4A, that's titled The History of NLP. And you'll notice in the upper left-hand corner a guy named Alfred Korzybski in 1933. Korzybski wrote a book called Science and Sanity, and it was a general semantics book. And in Science and Sanity, Korzybski said something really interesting. He said that almost all psychological problems were the result of the inability of a person to traverse logical levels. Well, that's interesting because, and one of the other things he said was that probably sometime in the future there would be a wholly processed description of a human being that would come along and actually describe a human being. Well, of course, that's NLP. If you look at Václavic, Paul Václavic was a linguistics professor in the 1950s. He sort of added to the beginnings of NLP, or the pre-beginnings of NLP, before it was even a thought. Gregory Bateson and Jay Haley had a great debate about ecology, which gave us some thoughts about ecology. And down at the bottom of the left-hand side, Fritz Perls was into Gestalt therapy. And I think Fritz was probably the guy that was the inspiration, along with Bateson, for kicking off this science that became NLP. Because around 1975, Richard Bandler was a student at Santa Cruz University, and John Grinder was a linguistics professor. And Bandler was into computers and Gestalt therapy. And Bandler happened to be editing a book about Fritz Perls. And Richard decided that he could actually do Gestalt therapy. And so he began to do it, and he was actually very, very good at it. And as Richard began to move forward and use the things he'd learned, Richard realized that he had a specific gift of modeling, being able to actually take what worked that someone was doing and use it and create something out of it. This is where the notion of NLP being an attitude and a methodology comes from. It comes from that idea of actually being able to look and see what is excellent behavior and how is that excellent behavior produced, and then looking across at the person and seeing that most excellent behavior, and then how do I take that behavior, which is really good that the other person is doing, and how do I try that on myself? How do I put it on myself and be able to use it for myself so that I can then create that good behavior myself? And so NLP begins as an attitude and a methodology that leaves behind a trail of techniques. Now, the rest of the people, including Fritz Perls, the rest of the people on this chart were people essentially that were modeled. The three major people that were modeled were Milton Erickson, as you probably know, and Virginia Satir, and Fritz Perls. And these people were actually modeled by Richard Bandler and John Grinder in the early days of NLP in terms of how do you create magical change in people? What is it that makes a difference? What is it that makes a difference? And how can you, simply by using the words that you use, make a change? And that's a lot of what NLP is about. A lot of what NLP is about is being able to create that kind of magical change. It begins with an attitude, I think. It begins with an attitude of curiosity. It's kind of like wanting to know what's going on behind what's going on. I don't know if you can remember when you were a kid, but the first time for me that I wanted to know what was going on behind what was going on was I saw an electric clock, or it might have been a clock that ticked, who knows. But it was up on the kitchen wall, you know, and I looked up there and the second hand was going around, and to me that was like so magical. So one day I actually went in and took the clock apart. Mom was outside, and I climbed up on the kitchen counter and took the clock down off the wall and began, I think I probably unplugged it, at least I hope I did, and began to look inside the clock to see what's going on in here. What's going on inside this clock? What is it that makes it tick? What is it that, and so that attitude of curiosity is extremely important in NLP. It's like, what is it that makes this work? When we look at a human being, it's not that we think that human beings or individuals are broken or even evil or dirty or nasty. We look at, with each human being, we look at each human being with wonderment. And we ask ourselves, wow, how is it possible that this person in this circumstances could produce this behavior? Now, the second thing, which might be equally as important as curiosity, is, of course, a willingness to experiment. To begin to try new things. It's like a willingness to try something new to see if it's going to work. And in part, that's what NLP is about. It's about this attitude. In fact, NLP is based in part on Milton Erickson's work, and you'll find Erickson there on the top of page 4A, and it mentions him in terms of hypnosis. Milton Erickson was, until his death in 1980, the world's foremost hypnotherapist. I think Erickson probably single-handedly was responsible for taking hypnosis off of the stage and taking it out of the Dark Ages and moving it into a respectable practice that would actually create change in people. Prior to Erickson, hypnosis was a lot about stage show hypnotists, and it was also a lot about one person's power over another person. And Erickson came along and decided that it was something that could be used by a medical doctor. And I don't know if you know this, but in 1954, the American Medical Association tried to disbar Erickson. They actually went to him and said, "You're practicing hypnosis, so we're going to take away your medical license." And by 1957, he had convinced the American Medical Association that hypnosis was legitimate. And by 1958, they came out with a statement that said, hypnosis was a legitimate form of treatment when conscientiously applied by a practitioner who had been appropriately trained in hypnosis. And Erickson actually worked and practiced hypnosis regularly from 1920 until 1980. Now, the way I've got it figured, if I saw 6 or 7 people a day for 60 years, I'd get pretty good at it. And so Erickson discovered a lot of stuff, and we're going to be going over a lot of what Erickson's discoveries were in this training. But he was incredibly curious. Erickson was incredibly curious. In fact, one day Erickson was walking down the street where he lived, and being a kind of curious guy, he looked across the street. And as he was walking down the street, he heard a noise coming from across the street. And he looked up and he saw this sign, and the sign said, "So-and-so Boiler Factory." I don't know the name of the factory, but it was a boiler factory where they make boilers, And in those days, they made boilers to heat the hotels or the large buildings. I guess maybe they still do. Maybe you could imagine the boiler the size of this room with plates of steel coming around like this. And maybe it would be each plate of steel would be 1 inch thick or maybe 2 inches thick, with 2 plates of steel coming around, sort of around, and then making a seam at the top with rivets along the top. Maybe 1 rivet every 2 feet or 2 rivets every, 18 inches, or maybe 3 rivets every 24 inches along the top of the boiler. And then around the sides, a seam there too, riveting it in. And Erickson, being kind of curious, said, "I think there's something to learn here. I think there's something to learn inside the boiler factory." So he went inside the boiler factory, and when he got inside, he looked around and noticed that there were workers inside. And they were going back and forth, doing whatever they did quite purposefully. And as he looked at them, he noticed, the first thing that struck him when he went inside was he noticed the light changed. And he couldn't see anything really in the beginning, but then he saw the workers and noticed they were communicating with each other. But he couldn't hear them inside. So he figured there's got to be something to learn here because they're communicating, and I'm not hearing them inside. So he stopped one of the workers and he said, "Can you get me the boss? I want you to ask the boss to come outside because we need to have a chat." So the boss came outside, and Erickson said, "I'm learning about how to communicate, and I'm really interested in that. And I'm wondering if I could sleep here for the evening." And the boss thought, "Whoa, that's a rather unusual request. I don't know if I've ever had a request like that before," but Erickson seemed rather sincere, and so the boss said, "Okay, you can sleep here for the rest of the time." So Erickson went home and he got his pillow and his blanket and came back to the boiler factory. And once again, as he stood outside, he could still hear the tremendous noise. And he crossed the street again and he went inside the boiler factory, and there's just a tremendous amount of noise. And as the light changed behind him, the door closed. And the light changed. And then it took him a few moments for his eyes to become accustomed to the light. And then the noise, he said there was just a tremendous amount of noise in there. And as he did, as he looked around and noticed the noise, he also noticed the workers, and he saw that they were communicating with each other, but he still couldn't hear them. Even after he laid down, he said the noise was horrendous because the men were jackhammering rivets into the sheets of steel, and the sheets of steel rolling out of the places where they come from, and all this noise. And he said he found a place out of the way. Not out of the noise, but sort of out of the way where he wouldn't get run over or anything, And he laid out his pillow and his blanket and he said, long about midnight, he said, I just managed to take all of that noise and put it outside of my head. And he said, then he managed to fall asleep. Erickson was quite curious in that way. Very, very curious. And one of the things that Erickson used to do, quite frankly, is he used to put himself in situations where he would have to learn something by putting himself in that situation. You know, one of the things we've discovered since Erickson is putting yourself in situations where you have to learn from the situation really increases the amount of dendrites in your brain, really increases your neurological connections inside your brain, really increases your ability of your brain to process information. Erickson was wonderful that way. It was like one of the main things for him was to always, always, always be in a learning state. And he was, quite frankly, willing to experiment. So how do we go about in NLP? How do we go about finding this trail of techniques with that kind of experimentation and that kind of attitude? And the methodology that we use in NLP is called modeling. Now, we're not actually going to fully cover modeling in the practitioner training because, quite frankly, it's a master practitioner, part of the master practitioner training. We'll be covering that on the Master Practitioner tape set. We will talk a little bit about modeling, and modeling is the technology by which the Trail of Techniques was created. So NLP is an attitude and a methodology that leaves behind a trail of techniques. However, giving you a technique is kind of like giving you a fish. And to be frank with you, my intention would be during this training and during this particular program series, as you listen to our Accelerated NLP training series, my intent would be to give you a change inside of yourself, not just give you the techniques, because quite frankly, any NLP trainer can teach you how to do techniques. What I'd like to do together is for us to work on changing your attitude and changing how you think. Because if together we can change how you think, you're not here because I learned how to do a bunch of techniques. You're not listening to this series because I learned a bunch of techniques. What you're here for is the change in thinking and the change in attitude that goes along with this. So with your permission, if we haven't already, I'd like to begin to communicate directly to your unconscious mind from time to time and to give you suggestions which will make a difference at the conscious level and at the unconscious level. And I'd like to make those suggestions such that when you finish listening to this series of tapes, that you will have the changes that you began and that you desired in the beginning when you set your outcome. And see, that was really what Milton Erickson was all about. Now, Erickson gave us a lot. But here we digress. So let's go back and talk about, we're still on page 4A, the history of NLP. Let's talk for a moment about Virginia Satir. Now, Virginia was into family therapy. Virginia was the grande dame of family therapy. And just very, very well known and as a great magician. People would come to Virginia, and Virginia was so cool because families would come to her and she would just sort of magically straighten things out for them. Amazing. She would just sort of have a chat with them and people would walk away and they would just feel so much better. And Bandler and Grinder decided that they could certainly find out what she did. And John and Richard actually spent some time studying Virginia Satir. In fact, Virginia had already written several books, and Bandler and Grinder wrote one book with Virginia Satir prior to producing what they called NLP. The name of that book is called Changing with Families, and it's still in print. Most of what we know as the meta model was already being done by Virginia Satir as one of her techniques in family therapy. And what she did was she just got more specific. That is to say, if somebody came to her and said, he hurt me, she would say, how specifically? And all of a sudden, as if by magic, the problem would seem to disappear, at least according to John and Richard. So they decided that the way to cause change with people was to become more specific. And out of Virginia Satir's work, they created something called the meta model, which means over model. It means a model of grammar. It actually relates to the entire linguistic model of grammar. And it means an over model, an overview of the entire linguistic model, which would be cumbersome. Now, they'd finished modeling Virginia and decided that one of the ways that you would change people is to get more specific, and then off they went to model Milton Erickson. Whoa. They discovered that Erickson was producing miraculous change, just as miraculous as Virginia Satir was producing, but he was doing it by being artfully vague. Oops. So what they thought was, originally they thought, well, let's get more specific, and that creates change. And then they decided, well, here's another range in that spectrum. And so they created the Milton model, or hypnotic language patterns. Now, up to this point, we're talking about roughly 1979 or 1980, they'd published about 4 books: The Structure of Magic, volumes 1 and 2, and The Patterns of Milton H. Erickson, MD, volumes 1 and 2. And at this point, we're just beginning the work on representational systems. But NLP was not really very well known until they began to include the work of Pavlov and noticing the process of anchoring. Now, the notion of anchoring is simply the process of stimulus response, and it comes from Pavlov. Pavlov published his first book, Conditioned Reflexes, around 1930. Interestingly enough, the notion of anchoring, or the notion of stimulus response, was not created by Pavlov. In fact, here's a little known fact. In 1902, a guy by the name of Twittmeyer made a presentation to the American Medical Association. And Twittmeyer said, every time I hit my patient on the knee, their knee moves. He said it's called the knee-jerk reflex, and that was actually written up in 1902 in the Journal of the American Medical Association. Twittmeyer also noticed, and he said in this article, that if he told the patients he was about to hit their knee before he hit it, that he could actually get the knee to jerk without hitting the knee. The American Medical Association didn't notice this, but I believe that Ivan Pavlov read that and began his work in 1904. By 1904, he had actually made a presentation to the Russian Medical Society called Stimulus Response and Conditioned Reflexes. And the Russian Medical Society and Pavlov began to work on that, which ultimately became behavioral psychology. And anchoring is based on that notion. The notion of anchoring in NLP, where we actually capture a stimulus and apply an anchor at the same time as the person is in a modified state, is actually directly from Pavlov's work in behavioral psychology. Now, Bandler and Grinder are off and running, and Frogs into Princes is the next major book published in 1979. It talks essentially about changing personal history, and also the first time that eye patterns were published. Eye patterns were also published in a book written by Cybervision in 1979, so there are actually 2 works on eye patterns published simultaneously in the same year. I'm not sure which one came first, but both of those books on eye patterns were published at the same time, and the Cybervision eye patterns don't necessarily agree with the NLP eye patterns. But personally, I've used the NLP eye patterns for quite a while now, and they seem to work very well. Those were all published in Frogs into Princes, where they also talked a little bit about change personal history, which I think would have an effect on timeline therapy. The next book was Strategies, and the name of the book was NLP Volume 1. Robert Dilts joins in now as one of the authors and becomes one of the authors. It's actually Bandler, Grinder, Dilts, Delosier, and Leslie Cameron Bandler, who wrote the book called NLP Volume 1. And in there, they included information from Miller, Galanter, and Pribram, which is just above to the right there, about the tote model. And the tote model was an attempt by Miller, Galanter, and Pribram to explain complex behaviors, which follows an anchor. This, of course, follows on the work of Pavlov. And Miller, Galanter, and Pribram decided to explain how complex behaviors took place rather than simple behaviors. They published their work in 1960 in a book called Plans and the Structure of Behavior. NLP actually has expanded on Pribram's work. By the way, do you know who Carl Pribram is? I don't know if you've heard of Cybervision, but he was one of the founders. He went off on his own and did a lot of work and has made a major difference in the United States, doing videos and personal development programs. And they're really an excellent series of tapes. And that's all from Carl Pribram. Now, next, Bandler and Grinder rewrote their work, Patterns, Volumes 1 and 2, and called it Transformations. They actually took a transcript of a seminar that they did in 1982, and along with the Patterns 1 and 2, wrote it in a more readable form, I think, and something which is more usable for most people. Transformations was written in 1982 and well worth reading. Also, the book Reframing came out at the same time, and that mostly comes from Milton Erickson's work, also published around 1982. And then for all practical purposes, it began to seem like nothing was going on in NLP. Richard and John actually broke up, and Richard and Leslie got a divorce, and Richard Bandler jumped on the plane and went to Kona, Hawaii, and he hung out there for a couple of years, and people thought nothing was going on in NLP. However, it seemed like Richard was really off doing something else, because in 1985 he wrote the book Using Your Brain for a Change. He'd already written Magic in Action, which is right underneath there, which in my opinion was and still is a sleeper. I think it's one of the more important books in NLP. And in 1988, Wyatt Woodsmall and I published Timeline Therapy and the Basis of Personality, which has proven to be a very important book for timeline therapy, especially and for NLP, because what it does is it adds in the temporal aspect, and we'll be talking a little bit about that.